Thank you. Aloha and welcome back to our bicentennial speaker series. Thank you for joining in as we share our 200 years of Christianity coming to Hawaii. Today our speaker is Dr. Ronald Williams Jr., who holds a PhD in history with an emphasis in Hawaii and Native Hawaiian resources. He is a former faculty member of Hawaii Nui Akea, the Hawaiian School of Knowledge at the University of Hawaii, and currently is an archivist at the Hawaii State Archives. His presentation today will focus on Keōpūolani and her influence on the early Christian missions of Hawaii. Please stay tuned all the way through the program because we will have a live question and answer series afterwards. But again, we'd like to thank all of you for tuning in with us today. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ron Williams Jr. Thank you, Ron, for joining us.
Mahalo. Mahalo. Aloha mai kako. O vau Ron Williams Jr. He malahini vau I kia wahi o kawaya hao I ka moko kona, I ka moko puni o Oahu. No laila e ho'omaka vau I ko'u mo'oku au hao. So I'm malahini to this place. I'm a visitor to kawaya hao. I thank them very much for inviting me. But I do want to start with my genealogy to let you know who I am. My mother is Janet Marie LaBounty. She was born in Chicago. Her family comes back from Ireland, from France, and from England. My father is Ron Williams Sr., Big Ron. My dad lives in the woods in Arkansas where he was born. He's a hunter, a fisherman, and someone who takes care of his land there in Arkansas. I was born in Chicago. I made it out to California as a teenager and came to Hawaii in 1996 from San Francisco. I was very blessed to meet my first kumu there in Lahaina, Maui, who was a Kone Akana. A Kone Akana was the leader of a group called the Friends of Moku'ula that sought to tell the 2,000-year history of Lahaina instead of the 200-year history that was quite well known. So I worked for a Kone there, ended up working luau, the Feast at Lele for a while, had a beautiful daughter who's today 22 years old. Happy birthday, Kiele. And realized at a certain point that I couldn't do luau forever. I had to get a real job. So I started going back to college. I went to Maui Community College. I took Hawaiian language classes, Hawaiian studies classes, and had a kumu there, my first academic kumu here in Hawaii, which was Keopi Raymond. Keopi Raymond taught us a little bit of language, a lot of Hawaiian knowledge, things like that. And I saw a film in class one day that really changed my life. And that was of a speaker that was the most brilliant, passionate, dedicated woman I've ever seen, and that was Dr. Haunani K. Trask. I came out to Oahu in 2003, got my BA in Hawaiian Studies under Dr. Trask, Dr. Kamei Lahiva, and Dr. Osorio, got my master's degree in Pacific Island Studies in 2008, and then got my PhD in Hawaiian History in 2013. So that's my academic and my familial mo'oku au hau, my genealogy. What I've been asked to speak about today is one of the foundational building blocks of Christianity here in Hawaii, and that is Mōʻīwahine Keōpūolani, Queen Keopolani. Very significant figure. It can be said that the mission would not exist were it not for Keopolani. There has been research done on her. There has been some published works done on her. But because of her death in 1823, which was only 3 years after the arrival of literacy in Hawaii, we don't have a lot of recorded written records of the Queen, but we do, but we do have oral histories. We have stories from people that were there at the time that have made it into larger histories, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I have a presentation to present to you that's called He Leo Mai Ka Lani, A Voice from Heaven, Harrietta Keōpūolani and the early Christian mission in Hawaii. So let's start. So Keōpūolani, here we go. We're going to talk about three things today. We're going to talk about Kuleana to start. We're going to give you context of her life and talk about agency, talk about her action in creating the Hawaiian mission here in Hawaii. Because of her specific Kuleana, her responsibility and her privilege, her rank, she was able to do things that many others couldn't, that gave a hand to the Christian mission. So we'll first talk about Kuleana. Next, we'll talk about mission impact. What kind of impact did she have on the Christian mission here in Hawaii? And finally, we'll talk about legacy, he wahipana. Queen Keopolani is buried today in Lahaina, Maui, at a royal cemetery there in Lahaina, in Waine'e, Lahaina, with many other ali'i. And she continues to inspire not only Christians but non-Christians, but people from all faiths in her presence there at Waine'e Church in Lahaina. So we'll talk about that a little bit also. Okay? So what kind of sources have been used to talk about Keopolani to this point? I want to talk just for a few minutes about historiography. Historiography is just the process of the creation of history. It's kind of like the history of history. Here in Hawaii, that process has been dominated for over a century by English language sources. Now, why is that a problem? It's not that English language sources naturally lie and Hawaiian sources tell the truth. It's that we've got a tiny portion of the population's view on Hawaiian history. Still today, at this point, if you go into the library and you pull 100 history books on Hawaii, at least 90 of them are going to be written from just English language sources, right? Which were the missionaries, which were the missionary wives, which were the businessmen, and so forth, the visitors here to Hawaii. Now again, that's not saying they're not truthful, it's saying it's a tiny view. Hawaiians wrote prolifically about their lives, their land, and their lahui, their nation. We have over 125,000 pages of Hawaiian language newspapers published in the 19th century. It makes up about 1 million 8x11 sheets. We've got tens of thousands of Hawaiian language correspondences, letters, back and forth from the ali'i, from the maka'ainana to the ali'i, and so forth. So there's a voluminous, probably one of the largest indigenous archives in the world in Hawaiian language at the time, which was the language of the nation. So over the last 30 years, maybe a little longer, historians, native scholars have been able to start to read those sources and bring us a new history. So I want you to always remember that when we're talking about these things, to keep in context the source of the piece that we're using. Okay? Okay, so these are some of the main sources on Keopolani that are used today. The first one is a weekly series that was written by Samuel Kamakau that appeared in Kanu Pepo Kuokoa and told a history of Keopolani, Kamehameha, but also with Keopolani and so forth. It ran for several years and told us the birth, the presence, the activities of these people through the newspapers, through the Hawaiian language newspapers. That series has been translated into English and came out as a publication called Ruling Chiefs of Hawaii. Now again, if the English is the only thing you can access, that's the best way, that's good to go that way. But understand that you're not reading the original source, which was Makololo Hawaii. So there are differences in translation and so forth. Okay. The second series was a series written by Stephen Deshay, who was a pastor from Hawaii Island. And he wrote a book called Kamehameha and his warrior Kekuhaupio. That book also lays out the history of Kamehameha, of Keopolani, of their children, and so forth. So that's kind of the second main source that came from that period. Those pieces have also been translated into English and appear as a book called Kekuhaupio, Kamehameha and his warrior Kekuhaupio. Okay? There have been a couple of academic articles written about Keopolani. One of them by Dr. Lyons and Dr. Langlis, and another one by Esther Moltkini. And they bring us much information about Keopolani. They've gone back to some of the primary sources and talk about her birth, her death, her life, and so forth. So we've got those two sources also. Another source is the Memoirs of Keopolani, written by Reverend William Richards. A very important source, but one that needs context. When I talked about context, it's that idea of always asking those questions of where did this come from? Now, I'm not doing that to get you to doubt any particular source at all. I'm not throwing doubt on any of these sources. What I'm saying is we have to understand as readers what they are, right? And let the reader decide, if you're a writer, if you're a historian, lay it out there and let the reader decide from themselves. The Memoirs of Keopolani are told from the writings of Reverend Richards. So when he speaks of Keopolani, things she did, things she said, remember that it's not a diary, right? It's not her saying these things. It's a secondhand account. Again, not to throw dispersion on that account, but to understand where it comes from, okay? I'll give you an example really quick. I'll pick on somebody for a moment. There was a book written about 20 years ago called Shoal of Time by Gavin Dawes. He also wrote a book that talks about Honolulu history. And in that book on Honolulu history, Gavin Dawes, who's probably the most widely sold author on Hawaiian history ever, his book talks about Nahianaena, the daughter of Keopolani, and it says Nahiena died, and this is a quote, diseased, debauched, and guilt-ridden. Okay? Now, setting aside the personal issues there, diseased and debauched, we could argue about, but guilt-ridden comes from the fact that Reverend Richards wrote that before Nahiena died, she felt guilty that she was not a Christian, that she had fallen away from the church. Now, I'm not arguing that that didn't happen, but I'm arguing that as a historian, you cannot write she died guilt-ridden without saying Reverend Richards writes in his journal that she died guilt-ridden, right? Again, not casting doubt on the source, but just letting folks know what the source is. When we start quoting people, right, through secondhand accounts, that distorts our history. So another important part on historiography there, okay? The last source that I want to show you today is one that's a really incredible source I came across in my dissertation work about 12 years ago at the Hawaiian Mission Houses Museum and Archives, and that's the original records book of Keopolani's church in Lahaina, Maui, right? Well, we're going to talk a little bit later about Keopolani founding a church in Lahaina, the first Christian church on Maui, that the records of that church were thought to be lost in a fire in 1894. As part of my dissertation research and other work, I searched for them for years without luck. Ended up finding them one day. They were in the Hawaiian Mission House's archives, but not cataloged. And we came across those, and those were the original May 31st, 1823 records of the opening of that church of Keopolani and the records up until 1875. So an incredible resource from the era about her and her church. Okay, so let's move on. Oops. Kalamai. Me not knowing the tech. Here we go. Okay, get out from behind this. So Keopolani was born in 1778 near Wailuku, Maui, right? She had an incredibly high genealogy, a mo'okuauhau. She was born from as a ni'aupio, as an incestuous marriage, through high lineage on Maui and Hawaii Island, an ulu lineage. So she carried this mana, this power, and you can think of it as both spiritual and political, governmental. She carried this power to be a decision maker, to be someone who would make things happen, right? So she's born there on Maui, and her mother is Hekuiapo Iwanui. Her father is Kivala'o, so that very high genealogy. Her genealogy, as I mentioned, comes through that ulu line, and one of the most important people in her genealogy is a woman named Kala'aiheana. Kala'aiheana was the daughter of Pi'ilani, Chief Pi'ilani, of the 15th and 16th century on Maui. She was a living woman, right? When she passed at 21 years old, her iwi, her bones were taken, brought to Moku'ula, which was a sacred inland island in Lahaina, and she was deified as the mo'okua, right? The mo'o goddess, Kihavahine. So Keopolani descends literally from Kala'aiheana, this woman who became the famous Kihavahine mo'o goddess. We'll talk about her in just a little bit. She was raised under that strict kapu. Esther Mo'okini says she had too many kapus to mention. When we talk about kapu, many of you probably know, but there were the kapu moi. When that ali'i came into the room, you had to lie down, moi. You couldn't be even looking at them. There's a kapu noho, a sitting kapu. All of these different kapus, kapu that if the shadow of that person fell upon you, you were put to death. All of these different kapu. And lest we think of these things as kind of eccentric oddities of religion, think of what they're doing, right? They're paying respect. They're giving mana, they're giving respect and energy and glory to that person. I taught at the university for about 10 years. If I come into my classroom and the students are not listening to me and they're throwing spitwads and they're ignoring me and so forth, how much mana do I have? If I come into the classroom and they stop and there's silence and they listen to me and they listen to my talk, then I have mana. They're giving me mana. So these rituals or these activities that might sound eccentric to us today were ways of giving mana to the ali'i. And they did that so that the ali'i could bridge that gap to the akua for them, could bring them health and life and so forth, okay? So just a little explanation there. Pursuit by Kamehameha. Very important to understand in the history writing of Hawaii, again, for the last couple of hundred years, we've talked about the four main deity in Hawaii as the four main gods, Ku, Kane, Lono, and Kanaloa. that leaves out a very important realm of deity, and those are the Akua Wahine, the female gods, who took no backseat to anyone. Think of Pele, Kihavahine, right? These were goddesses that were worshipped by women in women's heiau, right? Who tended not to be the historians of the 19th century and so forth, so we know somewhat less about them. Nonetheless, it's my contention that Kihavahine was the important deity for Kamehameha in creating a dynasty. Kamehameha was middle to middle high-ranking chief. Kamakau calls him ʻōlelo Popolo. He can use the path of ku, the path of warfare and might, to unite the islands and become king. But his sons are going to be challenged because of his genealogy, right? There's much higher genealogies out there. So while he can become king, he won't create a legacy, he won't create a dynasty without a higher genealogy. So he takes the highest genealogy in the kingdom, and that was Keopolani. So at the age of about 12, she's taken by Kamehameha. She stays with her grandmother Kalola in Molokai for a while, and then joins Kamehameha again on the Big Island. But he's taking Keopolani for a specific reason. She's the highest ranking person in the islands, and she has that lineage to Kihavahine, the Mo'o goddess. Kihavahine is a nation-building god, right? So Kamehameha will conquer the islands through the path of ku, the path of warfare, and his family will rule the islands through the path of lono, the path of genealogy. He'll take Kihavahine and Keopolani into his genealogy. His sons will rule, and they did, as Kamehameha II, Kamehameha III, and so forth. Okay? So Keopolani served that bridge for Kamehameha. In 1789, Vancouver described a hula and mele inoa, a name chant that was performed for him, honoring Keopolani, right? And called her Wahine Pio, the captured woman. They were married in 1795, and she took the name Keopolani at that point, the gathering of the clouds in the heavens, when she marries Kamehameha in 1795. Okay? So let's look at that link to, more specifically, that link to Kihavahine. And this photograph is it's a personal photograph of mine that was given to me by the director of the museum. Kihavahine, the only image of Kihavahine available today is at the Ethnology Museum in Berlin, Germany. She was discovered in Lapahoihoi, Big Island, Hawaii Island, in the 1780s, brought back to Germany by a scientist named Dr. Arning, and she resides there in a German museum today. He was doing a worldwide exhibit on gods, and he took photographs for me. So these are from that museum. So Kala'ahiana, the daughter of Pi'ilani, yeah, and La'ie Lohe Lohe Ikawai. She comes from that area of Kalua Okiha, that Moku'ula grounds in Lahaina, Ikamalu Ōlelo, in the breadfruit shade of Lele. Okay? As I mentioned, she's an Akua Aupuni, a government god, and she's the path of Lono for Kamehameha. Okay? Dr. Klieger. So Dr. Christian Klieger produced a Mo'okuauhau, a genealogy that links Keopolani and Kihavahine that I've listed here. So Kamehameha does conquer the islands, unites all of the islands, dies in 1819, has several wives, but his important wife, they're all important, but his wife that is important for politics is Keopolani. Again, she's the highest ranking person in the kingdom. She has that genealogy. Her children will become the future leaders of Hawaii. So we have Alexander Liholiho, born in 1797. We have Kauikeoli, born in 1814, and we have Nahiena, the Raging Fires, born in 1815. So these three children, post the death of Kamehameha, will be the rulers of Hawaii. Okay? So mission impact. Okay? So how does she have an effect on the Christian mission? Now, there's some very interesting research that I've come across in the last few years, through some of the work of others and some new research, that talks about the role of Keopolani in that first building of the mission, and brings a new kind of twist to it, and that is the role of the Tahitians that they played in that conversion also, and that building of the mission. So we'll look at that. In 1818, a Tahitian that was Christian from the London Missionary Society came to Hawaii. His name was Toketa. right? And remember, the language between the Tahitians and the Hawaiians is very similar. They can very easily communicate and so forth. And you would assume there's a level of trust between cousins that doesn't necessarily exist between strangers, right? So Toketa arrives in 1818 as a Christian missionary. We have 1819, the overthrow of the kapu, right? Kamehameha has died. Keōpūolani and Ka'ahumanu have overthrown the kapu, the religion. And we have this kind of vacuum of religion in Hawaii, at least as a state religion, right? People are still practicing at home and so forth. In 1820, we have the arrival of the American Protestant Mission from Boston to Hawaii. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions send those first missionaries to Hawaii in 1820. In 1823, we have Tau'a, another Tahitian, that arrives and importantly becomes kahu for Keopolani. Again, she, intelligent woman, her and Ka'ahumanu both are assessing this new religion. They're giving it a trial run. They're checking it out. We've seen that those men have mana, right? They eat with their women and the women, and nobody dies. They have these big ships. They have this new technology of literacy, of writing, right? So there's mana there. So they're kind of checking it out and testing it out. And Tau'a and Toketa are there to tell them, we've experienced this, right? And we believe in this also. Okay? In May of 1823, Keopolani returns to the home of her birth. So she was living in Oahu, Honolulu in Oahu with Kamehameha. He passes. She stays there with the chiefs and so forth. And she becomes a little bit kind of, I don't want to imply anything that's not evidence, but she obviously wants to come home, right? To her home. She was born in Wailuku, Maui. So she decides to come to Maui and bring with her this mission that has started in Honolulu and other places. And so she asks Tau'a, the Tahitian missionary, to come with her, and she takes two others of that mission who have just arrived months earlier, right? The second company of missions in 1823, and that was Reverend Richards, yeah, and Reverend Stewart. And so Reverend Richards, Reverend Stewart, their wives, Kau'a, and Betsy Stockton, African-American woman from the United States who had been with the missionaries. She comes also, right? And they go to Lahaina, Maui, back home for Keopolani. They arrive in May 31st, 1823. They have a mass or a service on the beach there at Lele in Lahaina. Hundreds come. Now remember, she has that kuleana, right? She has that mana. So when she goes to church, everyone goes to church, right? So you have literally hundreds and hundreds of people gathering on the beach there today. If you know Lahaina, it's near where the post office is, near the beach. And they gather there for the first Christian service on Maui on May 31st, 1823, right? They'll take that and move across the street and build a mission station where you see Reverend Baldwin's house today, right? And they'll build a thatched church there that will eventually move to the site where the church is today in Lahaina. So we talked about Toketa, we talked about the Tahitians and Hawaiian connection. This journal is in the Hawaii State Archives. I discovered it about 1.5 years ago, and it is recorded to be the first journal ever written in Hawaiian language. The first journal ever written in Hawaiian language. It starts in 1819. So this is pre the arrival of the missionaries. So how could they write? Because it wasn't a Hawaiian. It was the Tahitian, Toketa, who had been Christianized, who learned literacy in Tahiti, came to Hawaii and started recording what he was doing and when the missionaries arrived and so forth. So this Tahitian was the first written Hawaiian journal, and you'll see it there. The title of it is Historical Accounts, Contemporary Life, and Some Kahuna Lapa'au, Some Medicine in the Sandwich Islands, written by Toketa of Bora Bora and Kahikona of Norway. Now that's a mistake. Kahikona wasn't from Norway. He was from a small island near Tahiti that they couldn't pronounce, and they took it out, they made it out as Norway, people who wrote the title. But these were two Tahitians. 1815, the London Missionary Society had arrived in Tahiti. 1818, Toketa had traveled to Hawaii with Reverend Ellis, the London Missionary Society Reverend. He's placed in the household of Governor Kuakini, learned Hawaiian language, and began his journal. So again, why is this connected? Why is this important? Because you have a literate Tahitian, right, before the missionaries arrived, who now is going to, when the missionaries arrived, is going to become part of Ka Lani, part of their company, part of their effort, and give Keopolani and Kahumanu someone else to trust in this mission of looking for this new word. Okay? In 1822, he accompanied Kahumanu and Kaumoali'i on a trip around Hawaiʻi Island and writes letter of 8 February for Kuakini to Reverend Hiram Bingham. So he becomes, at this point again, that link, that bridge between the American mission and the Ali'i. This book, as I mentioned earlier, is an incredibly important book. Now, I'll mention how it was found. It was the first church records book in Lahaina. As I mentioned, it was presumed lost in the 1894 fire that burned the entire church. I was going through some newspapers in 1917, and they mentioned in a small blurb that Dr. Lydecker was the first archivist in Hawaii for the territorial archives, but Dr. Lydecker had discovered this church history book, is what it said, in the courthouse in Lahaina. So the book had made it to the courthouse, which is only blocks away, and then had been turned over and so forth and so forth. So that got the trail started, eventually discovered it at the Hawaiian Mission houses. But let's look at this. Records of the church at Lahaina, Maui from its commencement. Okay? That's the front page, right? May 31st, so on the 31st of May, 1823, the following members of the Sandwich Islands Church took up their residence in Lahaina, where, by administering the ordinances, communing together, exercising discipline, etc., they to a certain extent constituted a separate church, right? Those first 7 members of Keōpūolani's church were Charles Stewart, his wife Harriet, William Richards, his wife Clarissa, Betsy Stockton, the African-American, William Kamohula, and Kau'a, right? The Tahitian. So those were the first 7 members of an American Protestant Christian church on Maui, right? Now, Keopolani obviously couldn't become a member because she wasn't baptized yet, but she's founding this church, May 31st, 1823, for the American mission, and those are the first members. Ecclesia o Keopolani. Let's talk about terms for a minute. Ecclesia is the congregation, is the instituted church. Ecclesia o Kawaiahao, right? It's the congregation, the institution. Halaipule is the building, right? So when we talk about Ecclesia o Keopolani, we're talking about that church that she formed as an entity. Okay? 19th of October, 1823, at that church, Ulumahehe Ho'opili and Kalakua Kahehe Malie married at Kahalipule o Waine'e as the first Christian marriage among Ali'i. So in 1823, at Keopolani's church, we have the first Christian marriage of Ali'i in Hawaii. January 12th, 1825, the infant daughter of Tau'a baptized. So now we start to have more baptisms, more members becoming part of that church. 18th of April, Pua'aiki and Tau'a baptized. Pua'aiki, blind Bartimaeus, very famous, one of the first licensed pastors in Hawaii, native licensed pastors. He's baptized into Keopolani's church, as is Tau'a's wife. January 14th, 1827, Kamali'i Wahine Nahiena Ena is baptized. Very important note. So the daughter of Keopolani, right, who she's left entrusted to Reverend Richards, is baptized there at the church that Keopolani founded. 14th of September, 1828, the cornerstone is laid for Ecclesia o Ebenezera. Now that first church that was founded there in Lahaina was just called the church in Lahaina, the church at Waine'e, which was one of the Ahupua'a, right? Its borders Waine'e and Waiokama. But so it was called the church at Lahaina or the church at Waine'e. It moved across the street to that thatched hut. It was still called that. It moved over to where the present day church is today, on next to Prison Street, on Luakini Street and Shaw, right? And where that church is today is where this stone church was built. Not the first, but by far the grandest, most elaborate stone church yet built in the islands. And it was built by order of Ho'opili, right? Ho'opili was very close to Kahumanu and Keopolani. He was the governor of Maui. He was close to Kamehameha in his life. And he says, we're going to have a Christian church here in Lahaina, and it's going to be built here. And he named it Ebenezer, the rock of Ebenezer in the Bible, right? So that church becomes Ecclesia o Ebenezera in 1828 is when that cornerstone laid, and it is built this huge church that seats 3,000 people. And because it was the Church of Keopolani, now she has passed at this point. I'll go back to that in a minute. But so she has passed, but that legacy, that idea that she has accepted this, right? She was baptized hours before her death, means that the people of Lahaina, the people of Moku'ula, the people of that the people of that Mokopuni are pushed to come to Lahaina Church, and they do. And many are baptized and become part of that church. It was said in several instances of the Hawaiian Islands newspapers that there were 3,000 attendees at the church twice on Sundays. So this is the church that she founded. So up until about 5 years ago, we had no no photographs of the church. Up until about 1890s was when the first photograph that we had was. Another discovery as part of my dissertation was at the Hawaiian mission houses of a daguerreotype photo, circa 1853, of the church. And my former kumu, Koni Akana, I wished he was alive to see it. We all had imagined what the church looked like in 1850, but not only that, bordering the church on the Makai side was Moku'ula. It was the sacred island of the rule of Pi'alani, Kauikeaoli, and so forth, where Keopolani and Nahiena and others were buried. So we had a photograph of Moku'ula, of that inland freshwater fish pond. And I'll show it to you here. This is a daguerreotype photo from 1853 of Ebenezer Church, Keopolani's church, and in the foreground you see the fish pond of Moku'ula. Yeah, a really stunning photograph. But that is the church of Keopolani, started as the first church on Maui. Now where that church sits today sits Waiʻola Church. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Here's the daguerreotype, circa 1853. Once again, it's at the Hawaiian mission houses. Okay. Now, I mentioned the death of Keopolani in 1823. She was baptized by Reverend Richards hours before her death, became part at that point of the church. After her death, there was a funeral. She was brought to Halipiola, which is across the street on the Makai side of Front Street today. And then she was moved and buried at Moku'ula, which was, again, that sacred residence of 600 years of rule central rule in Maui and the first capital of the Hawaiian Kingdom. So she's buried there at Moku'ula. When I approached the church 20 years ago to meet them and talk with them and start to work on my dissertation, I was told that she had been moved from Moku'ula to the Christian church. It's about 200 yards away, and was buried today at the church, right? Since that discussion, we have found evidence. There are several oral histories and some written histories, as you'll see here, of her being buried at Waine'e. So, and I forget the year, Kalamai, I think it was 1883 or 2. Princess Pauahi, just prior to her unfortunate death, asked that the ali'i burials be better taken care of and found out and gathered and so forth. And as part of that effort, they went around and found out where these folks were. This is a letter from the chiefess Kalola, and it talks about hōʻike a Kalola no ka iwi o nā ali'i, it should be vaiho, kalamai, I vaihula ma Waine'e Lahaina Maui. So the ali'i bones that are placed at Waine'e Maui. And she lists there under paragraph 3, o Keopolani o Nahiena ame leliha, right? There's a former historian cultural historian of Lahaina, what's her name? Agnes, I forget her last name, Kalamai. I'll think of it in a second. But she talked about this burial, and she had an oral history witness, a kupuna who was there, who talked about that at about 12 midnight, they started to do the unearthing of the burials and move them to the church. And there was great difficulty. Pule were said, ceremonies were performed, and eventually those bodies were moved from Moku'ula up to Waine'e Church. Now there are still burials at Moku'ula. Dr. Christian Klieger and others have done excavations there to rebuild the site, and they've found out that there still are burials there. But we do know that Nahiena, Keopolani, and so forth were moved up to the Christian church. Okay? Here's a map. This is actually from Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum that shows the church, right? This is circa 1887. So the church there, the burial grounds, and the black part you see is the place where Keopolani and Nahiena and many of the other ali'i were buried. So lastly, legacy. So we have this understanding of, first of all, her mana, right? Her kuleana, her ability to make decisions, her ability to affect her people and society in general. And we move that into this project that is the American Protestant Christian Mission, right? And so we have that established. We have this church established that is standing today, right? And so we talk about now her legacy. She's been, buried for almost 200 years. How does this Hawaiian wahine, this Mōʻīwahine, this queen, affect people today? These photographs come from the 1940s and 50s. The degradation at that grave site, right? Overgrown trees, the concrete is starting to fall away. There are almost a dozen of the highest ali'i in Hawaii buried there with Keōpūolani. Okay, Kaumoali'i, as you can imagine, the Kauai chief, is buried next to her. Harriet the Keopolani Nahiena Ena, Ulumahehe Ho'opili, Kalakua Kehehe Malie, who was Ho'opili's wife. She's sometimes called Ho'opili Wahine. She also is the grandmother of Kamehameha IV and Kamehameha V. So she's buried there also. Kaumoali'i, the Kauai chief, Miriam Kekaunohi, and Liliha are all there in that royal cemetery. There's another photograph of kind of the overgrown degradation that's happening there at the church in the 1950s and 60s. And then a group called the Friends of Keopuolani was founded in 1984 by descendants of Keopoulani. I've met several of them, wonderful people. They started a group to honor Keopoulani and bring back that vision that she had and bring back that glory. We talk about the Royal Cemetery in Nu'uanu and how much it's honored and thought about and so forth. Well, we have burials of equal value, of equal historic value, of equal inspiration there at Lahaina. So they started this project of kind of seeing what could be done. Years went by, some very important work was done, but it never really took off. And then along came a wonderful gentleman named Keith Kamalani Onako'lau Kaleleiki. Yeah? I call him Tama. Tama is a wonderful man who took on that kuleana in 2011. Now, he had done it for a long time. For about 30 years, Tama had taken the kuleana of taking care of the burials of the church. So he'd go out on Saturdays. He was a member of the Waiʻola Church today. He would go out on Saturdays and water the lawns, rake, pick up, talk to kupuna who came by about the burials there, hundreds of unmarked burials that he took accounts of, started creating, records of and so forth. And then founded in 2011 a group called Nā Kiaʻio Waineʻe, the Guardians of Waineʻe. And that group took it upon themselves to really make this their kuleana. And they did. They brought back the instruction of Keopolani. They brought back the tomb itself. They had it repaired and fixed up. They started doing tours for schools so that 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th graders in Hawaii can come understand the importance of Keopolani and her link to the mission and so forth. That group today this is a recent photograph of the tomb, the royal tomb there, right? Another one there. And so it was this February. This February, prior to COVID, they had a 196-year anniversary, I think 6-year anniversary, my math's not too great, of Keopolani's founding of the church. And it was an event that was sponsored also by the county of Maui. Ellie Cochran, who was one of the county council women a couple of years ago, set aside the money, the funds for this. So the county of Maui, the people of Maui, and Waiʻola Church honored Keopolani and her resting site there this last February. Here's a photograph of some of the Nā Kiaʻio Waineʻe members. And finally, this is the event that happened. 196 years at Waiʻola. The county of Maui, Waiʻola Church, and Nā Kiaʻio Waineʻe celebrate 196 years of the presence, spirit, and aloha of Mōʻīwahine Keopolani at Waiʻola Church. Now, to give you the story of the name really quickly, Waineʻe Church, Ebenezer, the name was kind of, we don't know why, but kind of not used anymore and lost. And so they started calling it Waineʻe Church, back to Waineʻe Church. It was incorporated as Ka'aklesia o Waineʻe. Yeah? But in the 1950s, the church had burned down twice and had blown down 4 times. Now, one final story I have to tell you about the historiography. So, because it tells you a little bit about Kalamai, but the ho'okano, the way some of the early folks, visitors to Hawaii, thought of this as their religion, and Hawaiians thought otherwise. When the mission first arrived in Lahaina, and they were building the first Waine'e church, they built the church, and they started to build it, and Kupuna would come out and tell them, oh, you need it, and they're, no, we got this, we're from Boston, we got this, we're modern technology people, we got this, and they built the church, and it blew down 2 weeks later. And they built it again, and the people were saying, wait, no, come on, we got this, and they built the church, and it blew down again. After the third time in 2 years of the church blowing down, they went back to the kupuna and said, I'm sorry, what were you saying about that thing? And the kupuna told them, the kaua'ula winds. They come right down through the valley every year, and they come right back through here. You got to build the church over here, and you have to turn it into the wind and so forth. And I love that story because it talks about that knowledge of the land, right? That knowledge of your place, of your home that Hawaiians carried. So we always have to remember that when we think about this idea of a Christianity that wasn't theirs. It was theirs, and they understood it, and they understood it sometimes better than their teachers. Okay, so back to 196th anniversary was just this year. As we come up on the 200th anniversary of the founding of a church in Maui by Keōpūolani, I would ask that everyone start to think about these stories, the length, the breadth, the incorporation of these stories and how they inspire people today, right? I did a project, I found a grant and did a project with the church about 5 years ago that created primary resourced Hawaiian language-based curriculum around the burials there at Waine'e Church. I've listed a link in the talk to that place where you can go and pull that down absolutely free if you're interested in having that curriculum. But I can tell you this has been used now by Kamehameha Schools Maui, by several schools that visit, and to see the kids, to see the third graders, fourth graders, fifth graders, start to not only have this understanding of the Christian mission in Hawaii, but be able to link it to a li'i like Keōpūolani, right? This mother of a nation who brought this and instituted this for them. And here they are 200 years later, receiving that gift once again, and able to pay homage to her and respect to her back. Thank you.
That's it? I could have you go on for another hour. Perhaps we'll have you back. So I wanted to say thank you, everyone, for joining us on our virtual presentation. Again, stay tuned. If you have any questions, just write them into the chat, and then we'll relay them on to Ron. So again, thank you very much. Just remember, the third Sunday at 4 o'clock Hawaii time, we will be presenting another set of our speaker series every month. So again, we'd like to thank you. You can tune into our Kauai Ha'o Church YouTube if you'd like to listen to our Sunday services, as well as access some of the other presentations that we've had. So mahalo nui to Ron. We're looking forward to having you back. Excuse me, Dr. Williams. Mahalo, and now we will cut over to the chat. Thank you again for joining us.